Hina Usla, to Anna Sorum, Falcha Kuro Valik, Pronona. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished members of the Royal Irish Academy, good afternoon. My name is Brian MacCraith. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to this afternoon's proceedings. Before we get underway, I'd like to very briefly set this event in context. As you may have seen from the programme for this afternoon, each of the 3 panel sessions will be examining and debating issues that are germane to the work of the Future of Media Commission, of which I am the chair. Indeed, the 3 panels are focusing on the 3 goals identified in our terms of reference for the Commission, and we are very grateful for that. The Commission was established last year as an independent expert body to examine and to make recommendations to government on the future of media in Ireland. In particular, the Commission's principal remit is to examine how public service aims can be delivered and sustainably funded through broadcasting, print and online media in Ireland over the next decade, while ensuring that independent editorial oversight is maintained and Ireland's creative and cultural sectors are supported. In the week in which we celebrated World Press Freedom Day, it is appropriate to highlight the importance not only of press freedom, but also of quality journalism in sustaining healthy democracies. The overall facing the Commission is to chart a sustainable and positive pathway forward for the media in Ireland as it undergoes fundamental structural change. Innovative technologies and new business models are transforming the broadcasting, print and online media sectors. Changing patterns of consumer behaviour, particularly among younger people, are affecting publishers, content creators, journalists, broadcasters and advertisers. New dynamics in the basic economic paradigm, like the rise of digital advertising, are giving rise to important questions about how the media can be sustainably funded into the future. Changing audience needs and expectations demand that media organisations listen, engage, innovate and evolve. Over recent months, the Future of Media Commission has engaged extensively with the general public and with stakeholders and have run a series of online thematic dialogues. We have benefited greatly from listening to those in the media, to academics and to subject matter experts, and of course to the general public. As a Commission, we are committed to finalising our work in the next few months with a view to making recommendations to government in July. We are always in active listening mode, however, so today's discussion will be very useful from our perspective. It presents the opportunity to further tease out some of the most important questions of interest to the Commission. The first panel, which will be chaired by Hugh Linehan, will consider the Irish experience in relation to broadcasting, with particular attention on the independent broadcasting sector, local and national journalism, and the media experience of minorities living in Ireland. The second panel, which will be chaired by Sonia Leonard, will discuss current funding models from the perspective of different stakeholders. And this is, of course, of critical importance to our work. Our third panel, which will be chaired by ShinAwiL, will consider international best practice of media, while also exploring best practice models that integrate, represent and nurture young people and talent. Each of these 3 panels has a distinguished lineup of panellists with national or international expertise, or both indeed, and experience on these important issues. Each panellist in turn will make a short introductory statement, and the panel chair will then host a panel discussion with questions and answers from you, the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude by commending the Royal Irish Academy, IADT Dunleary, Film EU, which is the European Universities Alliance for Film and Media Arts, for their initiative in hosting and developing this event. And I want to wish you all an enjoyable and I know what will be a stimulating afternoon. We look forward to hearing what is being said, and we look forward to the recordings and the rapporteur's report that will become available in due course. So thank you all. Go raibh míle maith.
Thank you very much, Brian, and thanks to the RIA for inviting me to participate in this discussion today on a subject which is very close to my heart. My name is Hugh Linehan. I'm the Arts and Culture Editor in the Irish Times. Our distinguished panellists for this first session have been set a particularly challenging task of being asked to discuss the Irish experience so far. We're certainly not going to try and compress a history of Irish media in all its glorious forms and complexity over the last century or more, but I do think that each of our panellists is particularly well equipped to give us a perspective on key parts of the current context and to set the scene for the rest of the afternoon. It's not the remit of this particular session to offer remedies or solutions, but that's for later panels. But I do suspect that a theme which might emerge is of an Indigenous broadcasting and media industry which has been neglected, to be honest, by the political system and the state at a time of extraordinary technological change and economic disruption. But we should never lose sight of the fact that this is not just a question of jobs or of livelihoods in a particular sector being under threat, important though that may be to the individuals involved. Successive governments have claimed to recognise the importance of supporting cultural expression and civic discourse in order to maintain a truly independent Irish state and for it to thrive. But that rhetoric, I'm sorry to say, has not always been matched by the necessary action, and we've seen particular evidence of that over the past decade. Finally, we are confronted in 21st century Ireland by new questions of representation and diversity of voices within the public sphere. And those questions too, it seems to me, have been slow in coming to the fore in Irish media. So it's all the more welcome to get the chance to discuss some of them here today. Just a little bit of housekeeping. There is a Q&A function there on your screens, and we will be taking your questions and integrating them into the discussion later in this session. I'll say the same thing as I say when we conduct these events in real space, real time, with real people, in flesh and blood surroundings, which is sentences with question marks at the end of them are always more productive to deal with than lengthy statements. And I think that's particularly true if I'm going to be asked to read them out. So please do bear that in mind. I'm going to get going sooner rather than later because there's an awful lot to cover and time is relatively tight. I'm going to go first of all to Rosemary Day. Rosemary is head of Department of Media and Communication Studies at Immaculate College in Limerick. She's also a member of the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland. She's been a co-founder of licensed community radio stations. She's a long-time researcher and activist in community radio, and she's also the author of many books and articles on different aspects of Irish radio. Rosemary.
Garmagad Hugh, Brian, an RIA agus a cháirde. Tastinum branu an tauki ach I ggóhéics a tháinig rive. We say in history and in life that we're going to keep making the same mistakes if we don't learn from the lessons. So I want to bring people back nearly 100 years, back to the 1920s. And I think there are some very strong parallels between where the founding fathers, as they were all men, of our nation were and where we are now today in 2020. Because at that time, Ireland was a very new concept. We weren't sure what our identity would be. And all we were sure of was that we didn't want to be British. So we wanted to guard against outside influences. However, the launch of the first broadcast medium in Ireland in 1926, radio, brought with it a number of challenges that were met very clearly, I think, by a large scale vision, which was broadcast on the first day by Douglas Hyde, who became our president. And he said that what we needed was something that would heal division, something that would celebrate everything that made us unique and different in the world, something that would forge a new nation, that would be a voice for the nation, but that would enable us as a nation to take our place as an independent sovereign state amongst other nations in the world. So we sometimes look back at history and think that we were very insular looking and that we forgot all about the rest of the world, or that we wanted to keep some kind of an Ireland that was, you know, that hackneyed De Valera phrase about dancing at the crossroads and playing hurley and playing the harp. But no, right back at the beginning of the launch of Ireland's first broadcast medium, there was a very clear vision that this should bring and develop and foster a sense of identity and a cultural space where we could engage with each other. And I think that we haven't had the opportunity to work off such a vision since, until this year, when we have a commission that's invited submissions from the people to say what it is they want from their media and how they want media to develop, and how we want to support media financially, how we want to control media, how we want to get access for people to media, and how media can serve those goals. So I think it's really important that as we talk today about the mechanics of how the media operate and how Irish media can be found in a world where we have content online from all over the globe and from lots and lots of different players, that we actually try and develop and articulate a vision that comes from ourselves, that keeps an eye on where we want to be going forward. The 800 submissions that the Commission received, 100 of them from organisations and, you know, from the NUJ and RTE, etc. They're up on the website, but there are 700 submissions that come from individuals in society, in Irish men and women, who are very concerned about the future of their media. Some come from very invested areas, some are more general and broad. And I'm concerned to know where these are going to go once the Commission reports in July. Brian said that the Commission will report in July, but at the moment, there is a bill going through the Houses of Oireachtas, which is going to change the Irish broadcasting. It's called the Safety from Online Harm and Media Regulation Bill. And what it's doing is it's taking almost lock, stock and barrel the very flawed 2009 Broadcasting Act and transposing it into a new act. And there's been very little discussion of how that's going to impact on the current broadcast inspectors. So it's hard to know where all of these lofty ideas and great suggestions are going to go if the legislation, or if legislation is already going through. One part of that legislation that particularly concerns me is the anti-democratic nature, I believe, of the intention to remove the Board of Independent Oversight for the Regulatory Authority and to replace it with 3 full-time paid commissioners. I think that that's something that needs to be looked at and addressed. It's a concrete issue. Coming back to blue sky thinking and to cultural planning, this is a great opportunity to see what we want for us as a nation, how we want to see our identity and how we want to talk to each other and how we want to reflect on the world. If we don't have such a vision, all we're going to do is what happened for maybe the last 80 years in Irish broadcasting, a tinkering with mechanisms for funding, a tinkering with a large institution, coming late to the table in licensing broadcasters is what we see in our history. We don't know what the future will bring, but one thing it will bring is a lot more change than we can imagine. And unless we have a vision that we can refer back to, we will find difficulty in making all of these decisions. So we will always be late with regulation. We will always be playing catch up. And so I'm appealing, I suppose, to the Commission today to try and delve into those 700 submissions and to really craft a vision that the Irish people can sign up to and that our media can support, so that we can then support our media to make sure that we find not just Irish content, but our own place in this world.
Rosemary, thank you very much indeed for that. Lots of things to think about there. And we're going to go now to Larry Bass. Larry is, I think, very well known in the independent production sector as a producer and founder of ShinAwiL, which has produced some of Ireland's most popular television programmes over the last while. He's also a long-standing advocate for the independent audiovisual sector in Ireland. Larry.
Thank you, Hugh, and good afternoon all, and thank you to RAI for setting this up and giving us an opportunity to feed into this discussion. I'm wearing the hat of an independent producer and trying to bring sort of our world into frame. And as independent production companies, we're nearly at the bottom rung in terms of funding and where funds go. And part of the remit of the Commission is to look at the future funding of broadcasting. But I'll be a little bit less polite than Rosemary was in relation to successive governments' failure to address the need for legislative reform for funding of Irish content. And I'll specifically talk about Irish content rather than just a singular broadcaster, because we do have to mature our thinking. If we do believe in a nation state, we need to value our cultural identity. And we can't protect our cultural identity with a tsunami of cultural content flooding in from mainly the US and of course in the UK. We've always lived with strong content from the UK, but we've managed to compete. Those days are numbered, and they're being numbered very, very fast this weather. If you look at some statistics out of the UK at the moment in terms of penetration of SVODs in the UK. In 2016, there was approximately, just looking at the graph here at the moment, approximately 8 million homes had subscriptions to SVOD in 2016 in the UK. At the end of 2019, that had risen to over 14.5 million. So you can see how rapidly it's moving and changing. We have legislation in Europe under the revised Audiovisual Media Directive to allow individual nation states levy these content companies like Netflix, companies like Sky, like Disney, like Apple, Amazon. They're dominating our content, and yet at the moment we could be collecting a levy to go towards Irish content. The Irish government and successive departments have failed to enact this legislation. They are proposing further discussions. The latest timeline that I'm aware of would push this out to probably collection maybe sometime in 2026. So it's a long way away from today. And as usual, kicking the can down the road seems to be our only answer to fixing our issues in relation to Irish broadcasting and Irish broadcast funding. These things need to be addressed today. And we also need to levy at a level that actually gives us some protection. Some of the feedback and some of the discussion right across Europe is for a low single figure levy to be the number that countries will levy these content service suppliers. If we go in at that lower end, we will be completely out of step with bigger countries in Europe like France, that's levied it already at 5.1%, and also have the added requirement that these services must invest 25% of what they collect in France into content derived out of France. And I would push this against something which doesn't seem to be articulated in all of the discussions around these levies, that right across Europe, every single EU country has the protection of language. Whilst we have a fantastic Irish language and a beautiful melodic language with great history, unfortunately, it's not the language that dominates our airwaves and our content. We are in an English-speaking world trying to fight off, as I said, a tsunami of content. We need to be levying at a much higher level to compete, and we need to be enforcing an investment by these services in Ireland. Instead of always bending our knee and genuflecting to foreign direct investment, we need a government with a backbone that doesn't take its policy from only the IDA. We need to now start looking at Indigenous Irish companies that have the ability to compete internationally and have the ability to resource development and content that can compete. In relation to where those funds, when the levy does emerge, goes, I would really appeal that it needs to sit outside a regulator. The current Sound and Vision fund sitting inside the BAI to be funded fundamentally is at odds with what the regulator is set up to do. It's there to regulate. It's not there to develop. It's not there to have creative input. And we need really high-end creative development powered by funding that is there passing our front door. We could be collecting this revenue from the 1st of January this year, not pushing it out to 2026. We need to get with the program and start getting Irish people, Irish content to reflect who we are today.
Larry, thanks very much indeed for that. It's as punchy as I expected it to be. It's just to mention again to the audience, there's a Q&A function at the top of your screens there, and you can tap in your questions there and we will come to them in a little while. I want to welcome now Bashir Otukoya. Bashir is Assistant Professor of Advanced European Union Law at Dublin City University. He's also lectured in EU law and public international law in the past, as well as international asylum and immigration law. He's a PhD student in the UCD Sutherland School of Law. He's also in the UCD School of Politics and International Relations, and his current research, which I think is particularly relevant, focuses on citizenship, in particular exploring the political and legal process of becoming an Irish citizen by naturalisation and its influence on the idea of being Irish and also being a citizen of the European Union. Bashir?
Sure. Delighted to be here with the IRA once again. It's my second time, so it's always a pleasure. So of course, the Irish Republic of Ireland started 100 years ago, or just over 100 years ago now. And of course, there wasn't that many migrants at that time. Of course, migration and an influx of migration into Ireland only started occurring as of the late 90s. And so naturally, the media diversity was very scarce. But that needs to change in reflecting on the ethnographic changes and the demographic changes of the Irish landscape. And to reflect on the diversity, sorry, got a message, you can't hear me very well. So to reflect on the diversity that we are now seeing in the Irish society, I think it is good for us to reflect on the foundation of the state, which is the Constitution. So if you allow me to read Article 3 really quickly, I won't read the whole paragraph. I want to pay particular attention to what it says when it says that it is the firm will of the Irish nation in harmony and friendship to unite all the people who share the territory of Ireland in all the diversity of their identities and traditions. So in all the diversity of the identities and traditions, of course, that article came in the context of the Northern Ireland, the Belfast Agreement, but of course it applies in the context of the diversity we now see in the Irish population. And so the importance of getting to this, I suppose, this unity, the harmony and the friendship, the only way to do that is through media representation. You cannot be what you cannot see. And so if we are to talk about a Irish identity or reforming that, if you will, we need to value it and to see it not just as whiteness or as a Catholic state, but to view it as, I suppose, as the Article 3 says, as a harmonious state that welcomes and values traditions and diversities and identities, but yet we don't have a media that reflects on that. And see, diversity policies are anchored in the idea about how a functioning deliberation operates in a democratic society. And that's why we need diversity in the media, because it has the potential to achieve a variety of goals and a variety of values, such as inclusiveness, tolerance, belonging, representation, open-mindedness, as well as creating well-informed citizen, public deliberation, to a healthy competitive media landscape and industry. Diversity in the media can create opportunities for its users to encounter different opinions and different beliefs, to self-reflect, and that's important when we're talking about identity, to self-reflect on your own viewpoints, to enhance social and cultural inclusion by self-reflecting, and most importantly, to stimulate political participation, because that is the very foundation of a deliberative democracy. That's what democracy is. We come together, and despite our different viewpoints, that we can compromise and come to a solution. And we need those compromises to be reflected in what we see on our screens, because the national media, I suppose, is the place we go when we want to get away from our social bubbles on our social feed, when we want to see a real, I suppose, display of Irish identity. And when you don't see yourself, it therefore goes to suggest that you don't belong to that Irish identity. If you cannot see yourself, well, that's necessarily a neglect of other versions or other variations, if you will, of Irishness. And so we need to tackle that, because at the core of these values and objectives that diversity and inclusion policies serve is dominance, or that power dynamic, rather the prevention of dominance, and a situation in which we can find one opinion, one ideology, one group or one economic power which dominates all others. And the power of sameness is perfect in a homogeneous society, but we are no longer a homogeneous society. And we need to reflect on that. We need to reflect on our national media and how it ought to reflect the diversity in the Irish landscape. People need to see variations of Irishness so that not only are we receiving US and UK content, because we do, and that formulates our sense of identity. We also, now that we've experienced in the last 2 years that the world is much bigger than this little island of ours, that we need to spread. I mean, we have Irish pubs everywhere, but when questioned with, well, what makes you Irish? Oh, my parents were Irish, my grandparents were Irish, but it's so much more deeper than that. And we need to start thinking about that. We need to start codifying it in a sense on our national TV, on our national media, whatever form that takes, be it hybrid, online, or, you know, the traditional forms of media. And we need to start seeing representations, because that's what it boils down to. For an active or deliberative democracy to work, you need a representation of views. Sameness no longer works where society is varied. So I think I'll end it there. Thank you very much.
Bashir, thank you very much indeed. Lots of thought-provoking stuff there, and I'm sure we'll come back to a couple of those questions. Our final panelist, Jane Souter, is well known to me, and I'm sure to many of you. She's director of the Institute for Future Media, Democracy and Society in DCU. She's a internationally renowned specialist on the changes that are going on in media and what they mean, and, you know, key areas such as trust and disinformation. Her most recent book is Disinformation and Manipulation in Digital Media. Jane, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks so much, Hugh, and I'd just like to thank the RIA, IADT and everybody else for this opportunity. I'm delighted to be here and to be finishing up from a round of really excellent contributions. So I think it was great that Rosemary started with where we were 100 years ago, and hopefully I'll be able to put things together to kind of wrap up where we might be now and where I see the kind of the questions are for the next couple of sessions. And I think really what I really want everybody to keep in mind is that we're all focused on the future of public service media, but we need to understand this in a very different way than we might have understood it in the past half century. So we all understand instinctively that public service media is a cornerstone of our democracy, of our democratic freedoms. And indeed, I think we can agree that our experiences in the past 18 months with COVID have served to underline this. Indeed, in a report that some of my colleagues have done for the BAI on RTE, has actually found that, you know, many RTE staff find a renewed sense of purpose in relation to their public service mission amidst the crisis. And I'm sure the same is probably true for, you know, journalists across other multiple platforms. But we also know that the business models that underpin media in the 20th century, the first years of the 21st century, have essentially collapsed. So there's no point in this, I think, thinking back to the kind of halcyon days and trying to see if there's some way of finding funding just to recreate them. So I think the important thing we have to do is not on kind of propping up old models, propping up old business models, but where we need to keep our eye really firmly focused is ensuring that quality public service media and journalism survives. And I think it's great that we're actually obliged to act under European copyright directives. There's new things coming into the Digital Services Act, lots of other things that I'm sure the next two panels will address. And I think it's really important that the Irish legislative drafters grasp this opportunity and, you know, don't just transpose bits and pieces of old regulation into the new regulation. Now, I want to just think briefly about the kind of the importance of public service media and journalism. You know, we know that it asks questions of the powerful, keeps the public informed, provides the first draft of history, as the cliche goes. But this need for really properly funded news and current affairs, it has to be underpinned by editorial independence and objectivity. Yes, we need to provide for a public-owned and regulated platform for diverse opinions, but we also need to make sure that we fund the development of public service media of public value across multiple platforms. The other thing I think we need to recognize is that recognizing these as public goods doesn't negate like really important criticisms of news media and, you know, some dubious journalism practices. But the really important thing is that public service media is not public service broadcasting, and all public service media is not necessarily broadcast media. So I think we need to remember that public service media is predicated on the concept of journalism itself as a public good. So we have to broaden our range of where we say this is taking place. So it could be provided by national, regional, and local newspapers, specialist publications, radio stations, commercial digital platforms, freelancers, podcasters, videographers, you know, do I need to go on? So basically it complements and expands the service provided by RTE and TG Ceathair, and ensures that there's a, you know, really wide range of sources of news, information, faces, views in Ireland. But I'm really happy to see that the next panel will address this. I won't go into it in detail, but we know the public service media faces really distinct market and financial pressures. Larry has talked about some of it, you know, because we have this endless range of choice. I think Google and Facebook now take over 80% of all our online advertising. So it makes it really hard for Irish media to make money, and COVID-19 has done this. But the really important thing to realise is that the news media aren't struggling for want of audience attention. You know, people are still consuming really large amounts of journalism, either directly or on digital platforms. They just need to figure out a way to get money. So the New York Times might be able to do it, but even BuzzFeed and the Huffington Post couldn't, you know. So I think we need to note that, you know, Europeans have really turned to public service media. In Ireland at the beginning of May, 89% of May last year, 89% of the adult population looked to RTE as their main news source for COVID news. And they'd really large increases for youth audiences among 15 to 34s, but it's really expensive and time consuming to produce this news and current affairs, whether it's the Irish Times, the Independent, the Mayo News or TG Ceathair. And, you know, outlets are cutting staff, they're reducing pay, they're closing. Local Ireland says 16 regional newspapers closed and employment is halved. So these are like, there's major accountability gaps there for court sessions and council meetings going underreported. So we really need to think about this. So I hope the next panel and the one after will provide the Commission with some answers. You know, perhaps we can follow the Europeans and the French in implementing the copyright directive and, you know, taxing the platforms in some way. But I hope also that we can acknowledge that public journalism isn't confined to RTE. It's all sorts of other media. And so I think we need to address what counts as public interest journalism. Who should qualify for the funds? Who should pay towards these funds? And on the other side, we should think about, you know, should news outlets be penalised if they break ethical codes if they're funded for public interest journalism? And who would make these decisions? Okay, thanks, Hugh.
Thanks, Jane. That's terrific. Thank you. And again, loads more questions that we're going to have time to deal with. And I do see that the questions are starting to come in there on the Q&A tab at the top of the screen. But if I might just raise a couple of points first with you guys, and maybe with you first, please, Rosemary. Can I take you back just for a sec to the 1920s, but not necessarily to 1920s Ireland, but to the 1920s UK, because it seems that one of the realities of Irish media history over the last century, we're looking back to the 1920s at the moment a lot, obviously, is that Ireland has had this combination of a sort of a defensive crouch and taking its cue from our much larger near neighbour and its broadcasting model. And the Reithian model of the 1920s and 1930s has changed in many ways, obviously, over the years, but it was essentially predicated, as the Irish public service model was, on a single broadcaster, on a one-to-many system of information delivery, which has been gradually decaying now over several decades. First with, you know, the diversification, the launching of private TV and radio channels, other forms of communication, and then of course the internet, which arguably just blew it up completely. I know you said at one point that it's not just about tinkering or technical stuff, and it is about thinking blue sky, but isn't the reality that the idea of the unitary one-size-fits-all public service broadcaster is essentially over?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And even if we go back those 100 years, there was no concept of public service broadcasting then. There was only 1922, 4 years before, what the BBC were experimenting in. So what we had was a vision. We had a radio station that started, but was never properly funded to execute or to implement that vision. And very quickly, you know, long before the 1970s, when we got the outpouring of pirate radio, which was the people's response to how poorly they were served, we found that we had a very narrow view, a very narrow set of voices, the received pronunciation of RTE, the very, as Bashir said, a very Catholic kind of an attitude towards what Irish society and culture should be. So what I'm urging us to do now is to take the 700 submissions of the commission from individuals and to start a national conversation about what we want our national media to be able to provide for us. And once we know that, then we can decide where the funding should go, how the funding should be distributed, how it should be collected, number one, and distributed. And in particular, something that I haven't heard mentioned much to date by the Commission is how are Irish people going to find this content? So Larry's quite right, we need to pay for it, and we need to find, you know, innovative ways of paying for it. The old business models are gone. And Jane is quite right that we need independent, well-resourced journalism and current affairs, and that the audience is there for it. But how are people going to find it if there are so many platforms and there isn't a clear tracing? At the moment with broadcast media, we have under legislation, a regulation that means, or whatever the term is, that means that when you turn on your television set, the first channel that will come up, no matter whether it's Sky or Serviu or whatever, will be RTE, and so on down to TG Cahir. That's why it's called number 4, because it was given that place. How are we going to find our own media when we're all on platforms, so many platforms that we don't know where we're going? And I said at the beginning, they didn't know 100 years ago what changes were coming. They've been huge. And the very restrictive institution that we had in terms of legislation for RTE, and that later was opened up mainly by people power when the 1988 Act, when we had to have licensing for more stations. That's going to happen again. Who knows what's going to happen in 10 years' time, what way we'll be accessing content. And unless we have a broad vision that we can see what we want for ourselves, we're going to be coming back to not even the drawing table. We're going to have civil servants drafting legislation that will tinker with or just handle one aspect of the situation. I don't see us getting this opportunity again. It took 100 years to come, and I think that we should make proper use of it now to actually ask ourselves what we want.
Larry, before I fell into the disreputable trade of journalism, I was in the disreputable trade of filmmaking, working on dramas and feature films and things like that, and some stuff similar to what you're producing. And at the time, this is a long time ago now, there was a lot of talk when people were campaigning for the reconstitution of the film board and independent allocation to RTE budgets, of the need for us to tell our stories to ourselves. And I don't think that argument has necessarily gone away, but one of the things I find depressing is that argument still needs to be made from first principles. It hasn't been heard, or it isn't heard, or it won't be heard. I just wonder what you think about that. And I know, and I don't want to be, God forbid I'd be rude given that about the Commission, given that Brian very graciously performed the introduction, but I know that you feel that it forms part of a long-standing, long-fingering exercise on the part of the Irish state.
Yeah. Look, I get frustrated, I get annoyed, but I can't let my feelings stop me articulating the fact that unfortunately we seem to be sleepwalking into the same mistakes generation after generation. We have right now, where we are in the moment of history, in a time when we can actually do the right thing, step up and make decisions. We put people in power, we vote at the ballot box to elect a government. They appoint civil servants, and we have departments, but all of it comes to nothing when all they do is tick boxes and push things out for consultation, for further discussion, and we maybe we'll legislate maybe sometime in the future, and nothing happens time and time again. And unfortunately, it's correct, Hugh, the struggle was tough and hard to be an independent filmmaker back in the day, and the setting up of the Irish Film Board under Michael D. Higgins as Minister for Culture at the time. He was one of the future thinkers. His legacy is there as a shining example. If you look at the output of Ireland in terms of our ability to punch way above a weight at events like the Oscars, in terms of the number of nominations and awards the small country has achieved, None of that would have happened unless that board had been set up. Now, I think there's an opportunity to double down on that investment, to double down on our ability to have not just film punch above its weight, but now more and more of the higher end content that's consumed globally is television. And it's television on a form that's comparable to cinematic experience, and we will be left way behind. And at the moment, we are fiddling while Irish content is burning. And that's what I'm saying. There's an absolute abject failure of our legislative to actually do anything. And we have senior civil servants who time and time again will genuflect to Facebook, to Google, and to dare you say anything against foreign direct investment. You know, at your peril, will you ever say anything against these golden cows? Yes, we've had a great open economy. It was changed under Sean Lemass, and we invited in foreign direct investment. We've built a fantastic country. But what we're rapidly about to do is leave our culture behind, leave our identity behind, and is the you know, the pursuit of jobs, income, and taxes, if we actually collect any, is that more important than who we are? And I really think we are at this significant moment in time to actually make a difference. And the legislation is there to be adopted from Europe. Let's just get on with it. But let's not fall behind, and let's not under-legislate.
Jane, I confess in the past to have been something of an idealist, maybe even a utopian of the possibilities which were offered by digital media for 1,000 new flowers to bloom in journalism, and all kinds of small entities, independent entities, launching investigative journalism sites. And of course, in some parts of the world, we've seen a little bit of that, but we've seen an awful lot more of the kind of the decline and indeed the collapse which you described in your initial submission. And I still do find attractive the vision which you painted partly there of many, many different kinds of journalism occurring in different unexpected and new kinds of places, new forms and new practices. But the fear I have is, and you know this because you've worked in a newsroom as well, is that there is something about scale that's important to independent journalism, that an organisation like the Irish Times or RTE or independent news and media can stand up and can defend its journalists when they come under attack, and it has the strength to fight back against what can often be very powerful, very ruthless institutions.
Oh yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right, Hugh. You know what I mean? And like that optimism was part of a kind of a global optimism that, you know, about what the platforms were going to do for society and connecting people and the Arab Spring and et cetera, et cetera. And we've all become very disillusioned, and we know what they're actually vehicles for now. And, you know, I think the whole kind of, you know, putting it together with the news media is very similar. So I don't think I'm proposing that so much. I think what I'm thinking is that we need to have a discussion with yourselves, as well as with the publishers of local newspapers, as well as people with big podcasts, and that there should be a fund for public service journalism. So if the Irish Times wanted to conduct, and this would obviously have to be at a complete remove from government, but if the Irish Times wanted to put 2 reporters on a big investigation for 6 months, they could actually go and maybe get the salaries from here. If a group of local newspapers wanted to do it, they could get the salaries from here. So it could actually provide for somebody to set up a kind of a local court reporting or council reporting service that local newspapers and in some sort of non-profit way that local newspapers and local radio could avail of, because, you know, council meetings all around the country aren't getting reported. So I know that there would be former colleagues of mine in newsrooms who'd say, oh no, we absolutely don't want any government money. That would, you know, erode our independence. But I think if it's set up in a certain way, there's no reason why, you know, news and current affairs are obviously completely boxed off from the Sound and Vision Fund, for example. There's no reason why there shouldn't be a public service media fund that would actually fund the really important things, fund the kind of the watchdog role of journalism. And there's no reason that the larger institutions shouldn't apply for it. And obviously if a freelancer went in, then I don't know, like you know what I mean, I'm not in charge of drafting the legislation, but if you're a small producer like Larry, or well, Larry's a big producer, but still he's an independent producer and he's going in for sound and vision funding, he's still gone to RTE or gone to Virgin or gone to, you know, somewhere and said, it's going to show on this platform. I'm not going to ask you for the money to make it and then wonder, you know, which platform is it going to go out on. So I think it also comes back to kind of what Rosemary was saying, you know, can we have some sort of, and I think somebody might even have said that in a Q&A I vaguely saw, you know, is there a possibility of having some sort of platform where lots of Irish content goes on so people know where to go and there's kind of sub-channels on it, you know, maybe some sort of massive Slack for, you know, all sorts of different things. I don't know, you know what I mean? But I just think we need to think really differently, and we need to think outside of the kind of silos that we have put on before and the kind of assumptions that we had throughout the 20th century about all of these different silos and how they should be funded. We need to throw it all up and start the legislation from scratch, and not just be cutting and pasting from legislation which has been cut and pasted from other legislation for the last 50 years.
No, absolutely. I agree with that. I'm not sure if anybody can hear, but somebody seems to be chopping down a forest with a chainsaw outside my window, which is one of the hazards of Zoom. Hopefully you can't hear that. Bashir, I want to ask you something. I mean, you talked about, and in fact, there's a question here from a listener, so I'll integrate that into this. This member of the audience asks, is the current Irish experience of media as accessible as it could be? Do people feel connected and reflected in the content they see on TV and hear on the radio? I got the impression from your submission that you don't think that's the case right now. In order to address that, presumably that needs people who have those experiences and those backgrounds to be present in the newsroom and to be making the decisions in the broadcasters.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's a great question. And again, it goes back to that visual representation I was talking about, that if you don't see yourself on screen, if you don't see a visual representation of yourself, that goes to suggest that you will not be able to reach that position, that the positions that you will be able to reach are the ones where that you will be unseen. And usually that's reflected in our employment sector, where lower skills, even despite the qualifications. And so we need to address that by seeing a diversity on our screens, as I say, on the newsroom. And by diversity, I don't mean, you know, getting people to talk about just racism or to talk about, for example, you know, discrimination. There are a vast array of people, of ethnic minorities in Ireland that are wholly Irish, however defined. And, you know, those are the types of people that we need to see to show the second generation migrants that they do have a future here, that this is their home, that they don't need to go to well-diverse countries such as the UK, for example, where they see themselves in banks, they see themselves in courts, they see as judges, as lawyers, and they see themselves, you know, in prominent positions in life. Here, we don't have any of that. We don't see ourselves in politics. We don't see ourselves in the courtrooms. We don't see ourselves in major representations. And the media is the starting point for that. I always say education is the result for all this. And in terms of public education, that's where the media comes in. And in order to start changing mindsets and view sets and opinions, we need to see a reflection of diversity on our screens. Yeah, absolutely.
So how do we get diversity into newsrooms, Bashir? Because I look around my newsroom and there isn't any.
We have to actively seek, and that's the role of being a what's the word, a partner in a democracy, that you recognize that there is a power dynamic, you recognize your privilege, and you recognize that there are others who are unfortunate, who don't have opportunities to access these spaces. And if you are equally and diversely and inclusively minded, you will actively, and of course I'm not, you know, picking on anybody specifically, the advice is that you will actively seek out because they are available. It's the will. If you're looking for that, if you're looking for people to fill a particular spot, you will find them. The question is, do you want to go out and find them? And that's where you move from allyship to coalition, okay, to where we become a democratic society. Well, that's my opinion on it anyways.
Well, sure,
I think it's really difficult for, you know, I have sympathy with the newsrooms. If I look at our journalism cohort, you know, so many of the newsrooms hire from our journalism cohort, which is downstairs from where Bashir is working. And, you know, we've had some really talented graduates who are ethnically diverse, and they do have jobs. So I think the key is actually getting people into the, you know, getting people into DCU, getting people into IADT, getting people, you know, and actually providing that education and providing them with the skills. And then that makes the job at the newsroom and everywhere else a lot easier, because there is a big cohort. So I think we need to really focus on, and not just people ethnically diverse, like all the kind of different types of diversity that aren't in our newsrooms and that aren't represented all that often. So we could easily think about, you know, how do we get much greater diversity into our colleges and our training, and that could help.
You're on mute, Hugh.
Sorry, I beg your pardon. That was bound to happen at some point, wasn't it? Rosemary, I want to go to another question from the audience, which touches, I think, on something that you raised earlier when you were talking about the 700 submissions from individuals and what do the public actually think, because it's all very well for people to sit around and talk about media as a public good. This member of the audience asks, does the population in general see the media as a public good, and has social media not undermined that entirely? And that is a valid question these days, isn't it?
Absolutely. I'm going to, though, take the privilege, because I have the mic open, and just to respond or to add to what both Bashir and Jane have said about diversity. I couldn't agree more. Of course we need it, but it's not just going to come from goodwill. It's going to come from, as I said earlier, a shared vision, but that shared vision needs to be enshrined in legislation, and it needs to be constantly checked up on, and it needs to be financially supported. So if we look at diversity, there seems to be a misunderstanding that the last 100 years in Ireland that we were all the same. Absolutely not. In 1926, we have come from killing each other. We came from a civil war. That's a huge difference, that the radio station was supposed to help heal and help bring people together. Media are very, very powerful, but there are lots and lots of diversities that haven't been given equal voices. So Jane's work a few years ago on women's voices on Irish radio revealed very clearly that women haven't got an equal place at the table. And that's a huge, actually a majority of the population who haven't, until very, very recently, been given much space or much airtime. The same is true for someone like myself as an Irish speaker, that I don't, Bashir very correctly said, you know, you need to see and hear yourself. I don't see and hear myself on most of the media. Radio na Gaeltachta only came about because of people power, because of pressure lobbying from the civil rights movement of Gaeltach people. Radio na Lifa, which I was involved in forming, only came about again because young people wanted to hear ourselves, and the same happened with Glúiseacht Telefís na Gaeilge. So we can't depend on goodwill. We actually need to have a clear articulation, as Larry said, of what we want for ourselves as a country and what we want for our culture. And I think maybe that relates finally, Hugh, to that question from somebody in chat, which was, you know, do people see the media as providing a public good? They don't at the moment, and people don't necessarily want to pay for something that's going to be lofty or worthy. I think too much of this debate has been taken up with public service content. That's very, very important, but most of what we engage with in the media, online or through traditional media, is entertainment, and it's not necessarily or overtly about these major issues, but they have a very strong ideological message, and they do move us towards being closer perhaps to an American worldview. I find it alarming when I hear students talking about our president or what we should do with Trump. You know, so we really need to, I think, bring what everybody has said so far together. We really do need to think about what it is we want Irish media to do. We need to support Irish media to do that. And we need to be very clear in signposting to Irish people how they get it. And a final piece is we need media literacy, and we need that in schools, but we also need it on our media, because people need to be critical of what they're seeing and hearing. They need to interrogate where it came from, and they need to make up their own minds. They need the tools to make up their own minds about issues.
Larry, I suspect what a lot of what Rosemary was saying there would be music to your ears in terms of entertainment and other forms of culture being an important part of this discussion. This was touched on already, but Richard Doyle in Creative Productions has a question for you, which asks, do you think that a collaborative Irish video on demand platform encompassing RTE, Virgin Media, TG Car would compete better on a global stage against the likes of Netflix rather than them each having their own individual platforms? I'm guessing that you're going to say yes if they had the money to put the content on them.
Yeah, and that's one part of it. And we do have, like, there is Volta is a platform that unfortunately it needs more support and more Irish people to actually use the service if you want to watch great Irish content. I'd love to see a BritBox solution for Ireland. Why not have an Irish box, Oscailga box, or whatever we want to call it? You know, I think the most important thing said here today, frankly, is what Bashir has said. You know, if you can't see it, you can't be it. And that's not just about, you know, ethnically diverse people seeing their lives reflected on screen, hearing it on radio, reading about it in newspapers. It's about all of us. And I'm absolutely predicting that if we don't do something right now, not in 12 months' time, or 2 years, or 4 years, or whenever this department currently thinks they might think about introducing a levy, or need to come up with some other scheme to actually fund Irish content. And that's why the broader use of the word content is so critical, because it's content is all persuasive. It's all around us. We are consuming. Some homes in Ireland, if they're subscribers to Sky or Virgin, and I have a few other platforms on board as well, like Disney or Netflix, there are some homes in Ireland spending, you know, north of €150 a month. Some maybe closer to €200 a month. In some cases, that's enough for a mortgage, but that's what people are prepared to pay. They're doing that today, and not 1 cent is going into Irish content through legislation to those services. And that is a crime. That's a crime against who we are, and we're allowing it. We're allowing it under the guise of we can't say anything bad against these potential foreign direct investors. And I really think it's time for us to, you know, stand up. We're mature as a country. If these companies want to invest in Ireland, let them be here for the whole Irish experience, including partaking in making it better, richer, and making it more attractive for the next generation to be here. This is a good country. We should share it with the world, but we can only do it if we have the resources, and we will not get the resources unless we ask for it. At the moment, it's there to be taken, but we have a government who won't ask.
One quick follow-up on that, Larry. You mentioned France. I'm familiar with these campaigns over the years. Everybody always mentions France because France always does an awful lot more, pretty much, than every single other European country. So would it not be more realistic to look at somebody in the middle of the league, rather than somebody at the top of the league, or is that just an opening bargaining position on your part?
No, I mean, I think the French industry has supported its cultural expression and protected its language. You know, the French language is under threat as we become a more Anglified world. And if the French government didn't protect their language and didn't push for its support, it would be disappearing as well. And we could look at other countries, but why follow other countries? Let's be a leader for a change. We can lead in other parts of industry. Let's lead in culture as well. We have got fantastic creative industries. It can be a pillar of our economy. Let's not ignore it. Let's support it, grow it, and export it.
Rosemary, we only have a couple of minutes left. I'm going to give you the last word on this. When you look at the current environment, because that's what we're charged with looking at, are you depressed or are you a little optimistic?
I'm confused. I think a lot of people are confused. And it's because I don't like looking just at the present. It's not that I'm tied up in the past, but I want to try and visualize the future. And I understand from history that we can't foretell the changes that are going to come. It's a bit like Game of Thrones, you know, change is coming, but what that change will be, we don't know. So what we need is something that's going to be not rooted in this current time, but something that, as I keep saying, has a vision so that we can refer to that when we need to make quick decisions. Larry's quite right. We're too late coming to regulation. We're too late coming to protection. We're too late coming to support, because we hang about and we're not sure how this will be, and legislation takes ages to go through. But if we had a very clear vision, we could take decisions that refer back to that and say, yes, we need to act because this is our vision for what we want. And this particular technological development or particular incursion from a multi or a global business is going to harm us as a nation, or us as a community of individuals in all of our diversity. So I think that that's what we need to be thinking about, is where do we want to go? And then we take practical decisions based on that, but we take them speedily.
A final comment from the audience. An audience member says, does the passion of the panel not illustrate how important an issue this is? And I certainly agree with that. We are going to have to leave it there because the clock has ticked down for us. I want to thank Rosemary, Larry, Bashir and Jane for joining us today. Stick with us, because in just a couple of minutes, we'll be joined by the second panel, which will be discussing the current model and its appropriateness for the future. Thanks very much for joining us.